Good morning. Good morning and welcome to the 105th Landon Lecture on Public Issues. Before I introduce our guest speaker here this morning, I would like to introduce two other special guests. First, I would like to introduce a person who is traveling with our guest speaker. He is a member of the Polish Parliament and the present Polish Minister of Education, Jerzy Wiatar. I would also like to introduce a person who will be a guest lecturer here at Kansas State for the next month or so. He is an academic and a Russian professor and a person who was at every Russian-American summit from 1972 to 1991, from Nixon and Brezhnev to Bush and Gorbachev. Ladies and gentlemen, please join with me in welcoming Georgy Arbatov and Mrs. Arbatov. We are pleased to have as our speaker this morning the former President of Poland, General Wojciech Jaruzelski. Before I introduce our speaker, let me introduce to you other members of the platform party. On my left, Dr. John Havlin, Professor of Agronomy and President of the Faculty Senate. Next to him is our interpreter here today, Mark Dubek, Professor of Political Science at Benedictine College, and he was born in Poland. Very happy to have you. On my right, Edward Seaton, owner and publisher of the Manhattan Mercury and chairman of the Landon Patrons. Next to him, Dr. Charles Reagan, chairman of the Landon Lecture Series and my executive assistant. One of the primary purposes behind the Landon Lecture Series is to bring to Kansas State individuals who have made a major difference in our world, whose actions have changed the course of human events in a significant way. I doubt that there are many people who will take issue with me when I suggest that our guest speaker today could very well be listed among the 10 most important world leaders of the second half of the 20th century. The decisions he made and the actions he took literally changed the course of history. Well, what do I mean by that? To begin with, it was President Wojciech Jaruzelski who made the decision on December 13, 1981, to declare martial law in Poland. This was not an easy decision, especially for one who had served in the Polish army for almost 40 years. However, faced with unprecedented Soviet pressure over the rise of solidarity, some would argue that he had no choice. If the declaration of martial law were the only action that General Jaruzelski took, that alone would be enough to qualify him as a major historic figure. I would argue, however, that an even more important decision lay ahead of him. Having stabilized matters in Poland with a declaration of martial law, General Jaruzelski set about trying to restore the country's economic, social, and political structure. During the course of the next few years, if you just think back, it became obvious to him that this goal could not be accomplished within the context of the nation's communist government structure. Like Mikhail Gorbachev in the former Soviet Union, President Jaruzelski rose to the occasion and convinced a skeptical Communist Party leadership that the only answer to Poland's problems was to reverse course and to permit democracy to take its rightful place in Polish society. The result was something most of us in the West thought would never happen: a communist government that willingly shared power with a democratically elected non-communist government starting in 1985 and 1986. Very importantly, this transition was smooth and violence-free. Well, I would not like to go so far as to suggest that General Jaruzelski is responsible for the emergence of democratic countries in the formerly communist Eastern Europe. I think it is important to note that within several years of Poland's experiment with democracy, communism was dead throughout Eastern and Central Europe. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989 when many people felt that it would last well into the late 21st century. Clearly, General Jaruzelski and those who work closely with him set the stage for what most of us consider the most important event of the second half of the 20th century, the collapse of communism. General Jaruzelski's actions during the 1980s show once again what every historian knows, namely that in judging an historical figure, one must take into account all of his or her actions, not just some of them. Think back to Eastern Europe in the mid-1980s and the communist leaders of Eastern Europe. Erich Honecker, East Germany. Jakub Cusack in Czechoslovakia. János Kadar in Hungary. Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania. And Zhukov in Bulgaria. General Jaruzelski is the only one of those European communist leaders that is still popular in his country today. He might be the most popular Polish citizen in Poland today, that is, of course, outside of the Pope himself. Let me now introduce the former President of Poland and a truly important political figure for the 20th century, General Jaruzelski. General?
Panie Prezydencie, Panie, Panowie, dziękuję za zaproszenie do Kansas State University. Dziękuję za okazaną gościnność, za życzliwe przyjęcie. Czuję się zaszczycony, stając dziś przed Państwem w murach tej zasłużonej uczelni. Moja satysfakcja jest tym większa, ponieważ gośćmi uniwersytetu było wcześniej wielu wybitnych polityków, uczonych, dziennikarzy. Oczywiście dzisiejsze spotkanie nie jest typowe. Być może niektórzy z Państwa patrzą na mnie jak na egzotyczny, a raczej archaiczny egzemplarz. Nie mam tego za złe. Przecież jeszcze niedawno trudno było sobie wyobrazić takie tempo i taką głębokość zmian, jakie zaszły w ostatnich latach na wschodzie i środkowym wschodzie Europy. A jednak stało się. Tych kilka lat, mierząc ich przełomowym znaczeniem, to cała epoka.
We have decided that because probably very few of you understand Polish, what we will do is I will read the text of the lecture, and General Jaruzelski will resume toward the end, and this way you will have more time for possible questions to him.
Tu może taką wtrącę jedną żartobliwą dygresję. Kiedyś Trygve
He wants to tell you
żyjący
an
już
anecdote
były sekretarz generalny Organizacji Narodów Zjednoczonych,
about the General Secretary of the United Nations that unfortunately has already died, passed away.
powiedział, że o polityce decydują zarówno mężowie stanu, jak i tłumacze.
He said that in politics, not only outstanding political leaders are important, but also their translators.
Z tą myślą przekazuję głos.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, let me express my gratitude for the invitation to Kansas State University, for the hospitality received and the warmth of your reception. I feel honored to stand today within the walls of such a merited university. My satisfaction is all the greater when I remember that Kansas State University has hosted so many eminent politicians, men of learning, and journalists. Clearly, today's meeting is far from usual. Some of you, perhaps, look at me like some exotic or rather archaic animal. That is wholly natural. After all, it would have been impossible only a short time ago even to imagine the rate and the depth of the transformations which developed in recent years in eastern and central parts of Europe. But they did happen. Those few years are a whole era when measured by the crucial impact they exerted. Naturally, I shall focus my remarks on Poland's problems, since I accept that self-evaluation should always have a personal starting point. In this case, the Polish people. Above all, an assessment of our own shortcomings and errors must be made. Though I have no intention to restrict myself to a narrow Polonocentric viewpoint, Poland is not situated in a territorial vacuum on some uninhabited island. Indeed, the opposite is true. It lies in the most geostrategically sensitive part of Europe. In those years that I will examine today, Europe and the world were divided into two opposing political and military blocs. That meant that all internal conflicts inevitably led to external repercussions, reflecting on the climate of relations and the pattern of international forces. This is why I found myself to use a descriptive phrase in the early 1980s, between the rock of internal conflicts and the hard place of external danger. Politicians, historians, and men in the street differ in their evaluation of the political situation in Poland in the early 1980s. These differences are bound to exist. Such is the fate of all controversial historical events. That is one side of the coin. The other, to which I attach particular importance, is the results of opinion polls held inside Poland. For years now, they have displayed a decisive majority of those who accept that the introduction of martial law was justified, over those who express a different point of view. I must admit, I spent much time deliberating how to construct this lecture addressed to the eminent persons present in this hall. Should I focus on the historical aspect, or perhaps on the political, or should I present my personal reflective thinking? But everything is obviously important, so I have to touch on each such aspect. But I am simultaneously counting on being allowed to expand on them when replying to the questions which you may wish to ask. That apart, I wish to focus my greatest attention on presenting my own stance and what I observed, felt, and decided in that complex year of 1981. The introduction of martial law was the most dramatic decision I have ever taken, and life has treated me harshly. I experienced my country's tragedy in 1939 and my deportation to the Siberian taiga. Finally, the long frontline road I traveled as a young officer of reconnaissance units from Central Russia to Central Germany, from the Oka River to Elba. I had to face up to many dangers, often looking death in the face. Later, in the decades which followed, I often had to resolve complex dilemmas. But the dilemma of 1981 was quite different, had a different dimension, and the very greatest specific weight, since I bore the responsibility for the fate of the nation and country. The civilized world, through literature, theater, and film, is well acquainted with the perplexities which Hamlet had to face. But the perplexities of politicians are much less known and spectacular through carrying an enormous dramatic charge. I spent the weeks prior to taking the decision on martial law as in some horrible nightmare. I entertained thoughts of suicide. So what held me back? The sense of responsibility for my family, friends, and country, and the awareness that suicide would be a form of desertion, unworthy an old soldier. You might well ask, why was another way out of the situation not found? Who carries the blame for that? My reply is everyone and no one. Everyone, since all parties, the authorities and Solidarnosc, committed errors. No one, since such is the outcome of assessing the realities of the internal situation and contemporary international conditions. Karl Marx, an author who is admittedly unfashionable today, wrote in his Louis Bonaparte's 18th Brumaire, quote, "People create their history by themselves, but do not create it freely, nor in circumstances they themselves have chosen, but in those in which they directly find themselves, which were given them and inherited by them." End of quotation. So what were the circumstances in which the history of 1981 was created? It was very much something of a political, social, and economic earthquake, for which we were quite unprepared. Government and Solidarnosc were miles apart. The high temperature of the conflict raised an emotional barrier between us and darkened what could have been a rational picture. The most important thing is to hit the bullseye at the historically most appropriate moment, which is why all opportunist foot-dragging is intolerable. But any historical false starts and voluntaristic acceleration are also dangerous. Grain and fruit, and also society, must have time to ripen, especially the homo politicus. How much time it took and how much blood was shed for Ortega's agreement with Chamorro, de Klerk's with Mandela, Arafat's with Rabin to come to fruition. Time was also required for Jaruzelski's agreement with Walesa to mature. I would like to treat this personification in symbolic terms, since neither Walesa nor Jaruzelski acted alone, but in specific political formations, in concrete psychological, social, and economic conditions. Solidarnosc clearly enjoys historical merits, but it was a movement of many millions and also a conglomerate of diverse orientations, from right-wing nationalists to extreme left-wing populists. It boasted moderate, realistic members, but there were also extreme currents. And it was those who gained an increasingly strong and predominant position. This movement was cemented and bonded by the struggle with the system. When the system collapsed, Solidarnosc disintegrated into numerous mutually combatant political groupings. That was, I have to state, one of the reasons for the election successes registered by left-wing forces in recent years. The authorities of the Polish People's Republic, pro-socialist forces in the widest meaning of the term, were also no homogeneous organism. It included reformatory democratic circles, of which Jerzy Wiatr, member of parliament and minister circles, and now member of parliament and minister of national education, was a leading representative. But active and influential dogmatic conservative circles also existed. Even worse, some of these cooperated in various ways with our neighbors. and even encouraged them to intervene in Poland. This, in effect, was equal to treason. One must regret that it was difficult to give sufficient proof of this in those days. You must remember that we were within the bloc of states where real socialism was the prevailing future. Such was the outcome of the post-war division of Europe, a sick division. Even so, I accepted our place in the Warsaw Pact as the optimal solution for Poland, particularly as regards the inviolability of our frontiers. One can always change one's views. I also have fundamentally changed mine, not only in theory, but in practice. I may sound immodest, but I must say that as the initiator of the Round Table, and next as President of the Republic of Poland, I effectively contributed to the dismantling of the old system. I'm not trying to claim that I differed from what I really was during the period of real socialism. Such is an elementary requirement of political credibility. I'm saying this to avoid any suspicion that I want to defend, and no matter what price, the decisions I took. Martial law was an evil which resulted in various human vexations and sufferings which I very much regret. But even so, they were a lesser evil than the multi-dimensional catastrophe which faced us as a very real danger. Jacek Kuroń, a leading representative of the of the contemporary opposition, once said, quote, "Solidarnosc is like a train which travels around the country, outside the timetable. So a major crash is inevitable, sooner or later," the end of quote. I would like at this point to use a metaphor of my own construction. A train is traveling fast in a fog. The rails are unstable and increasingly shaky. The train could jump the track. The train driver suddenly puts on the brakes. The passengers are thrown around in shock. A number are bruised and injured, but they have all survived. The track is repaired, the fog lifts, the train continues on its own way to reach its safe destination, the Round Table. How did the track become so unstable? It was a hellacious coincidence of events, facts, and circumstances. The situation in Poland was becoming increasingly dangerous. All the dangers accumulated and intensified in the closing weeks of 1981. Anarchy and chaos prevailed. The structures of the state were paralyzed. Solidarnosc rejected our offer to reach accord. A general strike was imminent. Huge demonstrations were planned for the 17th of December in Warsaw and several other cities. Emotions were explosive and spiraling. The gasoline had been spilled, so to speak. All that was needed was an innocent incident, not to suggest provocation, for those demonstrations to explode into something similar to what happened in Budapest in 1956. The economy had become the scene of political infighting. Industrial production plummeted. The shops were empty. We were staring hunger, cold, and blackout in the face. Events were developing at a furious pace, like some huge foaming river. The situation had got completely out of control. The government, the Solidarnosc leadership, and the church's authority proving futile. The extreme forces within Solidarnosc had imposed a radical course of events, while conservative groupings within the organs of government were unable to compromise. A coup d'etat even was possible. The conservative forces were counting, not without grounds, on assistance from the Soviet Union and other countries of this bloc. It is not difficult, with hindsight, to speculate theoretically and to discover miraculous solutions. But the realities in practice of those days were enormously complex. No ideal way out of the situation existed. There could only be a greater or lesser evil. In politics, one speaks of a disaster of historical dimensions, of defeat of strategical dimensions, or of a setback of tactical dimensions. The latter are part of each and every government, but should they not be too numerous and not become a negative process, they may be painful but not serious in final outcome. Strategical defeat does not have always to be related to a specific decision, act, or fact. I would situate the inability to reach a national agreement before the 13th of December 1981 among such defeats. Finally, a historical disaster occurs when its national effects are of enormous specific weight and are primarily irrevocable, while being soaked in a river of spilled blood. Should you ask whether we in Poland successfully passed our historical exam, I again have to reply both yes and no. No, because I have already mentioned we proved unable, incapable of finding accord. Yes, because we passed through those turbulent times with greater casualties, without greater casualties, without burning the bridges towards future positive solutions. Indeed, the opposite is true. We were gradually creating the bridgeheads for the reforms which laid ahead. We were in the group of the forerunners. The outcome was that when Gorbachev appeared, we had become something of a perestroika laboratory, and in the late 1980s, the force and pattern for transformations throughout the whole region. To summarize, one could say that we were all losers when we found ourselves unable to reach accord and avoid martial law. Though it was no catastrophe, it was a transient, lesser evil. But in the longer time dimension, we were all winners. The nation, Poland, and peace in Europe had won. You have the right to ask whether the role and responsibility of government and Solidarnosc can be situated on one plane. After all, government was defending a state of limited sovereignty, of stunted democracy, of poor economic effectiveness. Solidarnosc fought against that state. In consequence, was reaching for the reins of government. My reply is that 1980 and 1981 were a period of enormous ferment. All, from the far left to the far right, government and opposition, accepted that changes were imperative. The drama lay in the government foot-dragging and offering too little, while Solidarnosc was moving too fast and demanding too much. And all that was happening in a concrete historical moment. It was in 1980 and 1981 that East-West relations deteriorated yet again. Poland became something of a testing ground for that process. I'm a military professional. In my office as government prime minister and minister of defense, a large map hangs on the wall. I often used to study it intently. The divisions in Europe and the world were clearly visible. An A had been declared in Yalta and Potsdam. The Brezhnev Doctrine was a B of fatal consequences. I knew many Soviet marshals and generals. Some were my friends. They could also read maps. I knew very well that there was a limit beyond which the Polish schism and the Polish heretic road could not and would not be tolerated. Let it not be thought that I'm looking for some simple self-justification. I never claimed that the Soviet Union was quivering with the desire for military intervention in Poland. This for them, too, was a dark scenario. But to lose Poland as an exceptionally important, indeed crucial link within the bloc was even worse. I would at this moment point to a place in Alexander Haig's book where he says that Poland to the Soviet Union was a casus belli, an issue for which it was ready to go to war. The Poles cannot alone become the masters of their own fate, she suggested, as long as the USSR holds superior power and opposes it. There was never any doubt that the mass movement in Poland would be strangled by the USSR. The only question was when, and with what degree of brutality would that happen, claimed Alexander Haig. In turn, Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his book Game Plan, wrote that to the Soviets, to rule Poland was the key to control East Europe. Poland's geostrategical importance, he remarked, exceeds the fact that it lies on the way to Germany. Moscow needed to exert rule of Poland, also because that made it easier to control Czechoslovakia and Hungary, and isolated non-Russian minorities in the Soviet Union from Western influence. A Poland with greater autonomy would undermine control of Lithuania and Ukraine. The 37 million strong Poland was the largest East European country under Soviet rule, its armed forces being the Warsaw Pact's largest non-Soviet army. That position, wrote Brzezinski, cost Moscow a lot, but would cost it even more were it to relinquish it. So much Zbigniew Brzezinski's thinking. It is significant that his book was published in 1987, when the international situation was incomparably better than in 1981. I was fully aware of the situation. I was subject to a continuous wave of grievances, accusations, and threats, in which not only the Soviet voice was audible, it was amplified by non-stop criticizing, particularly from the GDR and Czechoslovakia. I shall never forget the dramatic meeting I had with Marshal Dmitry Ustinov, Soviet defense minister, during the wide flank West 81 maneuvers, held in September 1981 near Poland's eastern and northern frontier. Warsaw Pact army concentrations and movements around our borders had been going on for a considerable time, continuing even after martial law had been introduced. This took place against the background of political and economic pressure. I could highlight the message approved on the 21st of November 1981 by the Soviet Communist Party Political Bureau, which Leonid Brezhnev sent me, very similar in tone to the notorious letters addressed to Alexander Dubček in 1968. A no less threatening situation was caused by what was, in effect, an ultimatum, announcing a drastic cut in the supplies of gas, crude oil, and many other vitally important materials as of the 1st of January 1982. Were it not for the declaration of martial law, the substantiation of that announcement in midwinter would have signified not only economic, but also biological catastrophe. No grand issues and dilemmas may be studied without their historical background, in separation from the realities of a given moment. A historian seated in the tranquility of archives and libraries can allow his thoughts wander in various directions. Basing on continually supplemented sources, he knows today what took place in the past. But a politician active at that time knew only what was happening at a given moment. And he also had to take into account that which could still take place. A historian enjoys the comfort of delivering evaluations which have no practical effects. A politician has to bear the weight of decisions whose effects are often enormous. And those decisions have to be taken. A controversial decision is better than no decision or waiving it, since it permits a situation to be brought under control, while allowing it to be reined in with the possibility of correction. The absence of a decision could result in an impetuous, dangerous development of a situation which has got out of any control. There's no ideal solution in such circumstances. The only thing is to find the optimal solution, a lesser evil. With the 14 years of perspective which we enjoy today, I can say that I'm still firmly convinced that the introduction of martial law was the optimal, indeed, salutary decision. The final outcome is the overriding factor, the fundamental transformations of 1989 and 1990 being its most evident illustration. Without the purgatory of martial law, those transformations would be unrealistic today. I beg you not to treat what I have said as some expression of megalomania. The imminent explosion, confrontation within Poland, and the inevitable internationalization of events would have pushed positive historical process into the indefinite future. They could have commenced in the mid-1980s, only in conditions of peace and international détente. Destabilization in Poland and around Poland would have erected barriers to those processes and, in the final account, frustrated them. The Polish people have always admired and displayed warm sentiment for the United States of America, that large and magnificent country. I still bear in my memory that moment on the 4th of May, 1945, when I reached the Elba River in the ranks of the Polish army. American troops had appeared at much the same time on its opposite bank. We greeted one another with very great warmth. Many years have passed since then. The Iron Curtain set us apart, but distinct from other nations of the Soviet bloc, we succeeded in creating and widening various gaps in that curtain. Cooperation and various forms of contacts continued to exist. The early 1980s saw tensions developing between our two countries. Many of them remain unsatisfactorily explained, and political scientists and historians will continue to debate them for many years. I must admit that I did react painfully and even nervously to a number of American opinions, decisions, and activities. I sensed that US politicians were presenting the Polish authorities as out-and-out devils and were whitewashing Solidarnosc. This was a reflection of what medieval theologians used to say that, quote, even should Satan speak the truth, he must be lying. I also got the impression that I was being treated as Pol Pot, Gaddafi, and Noriega taken together. Then there were the restrictions, the sanctions imposed on the Polish economy. I really do not feel that they were I really do feel that they were unjustified. They harmed not so much the government as the Polish people above all. It was they who suffered the vital material consequences. More, these restrictions harmed the reform process and pushed us even deeper into the embrace of the Warsaw Pact, making the economy dependent on Poland's socialist partners. That was when the bitter saying was coined in Poland that President Reagan should be awarded a medal for what he did for Comecon. You must not read what I have said as some expression of grievance. Today I see the mechanisms on the ground of historical confrontation between East and West in a much wider and deeper perspective. The Polish issue was only one link in this whole front of events. Peter Schweitzer, the American journalist, had some interesting and very competent things to say on this matter in his recently published book, Victory.
Stany Zjednoczone prowadziły i prowadzą politykę globalną. Jej głównym celem było zepchnięcie Związku Radzieckiego, Układu Warszawskiego do defensywy, osłabienie go i dezintegrację. Cel długofalowy to takie przeobrażenia, które przyniosą likwidację dwubiegunowości świata oraz upowszechnienie podstawowych standardów demokracji, gospodarki rynkowej, praw człowieka. Do tego, że tak się stało, przyczynił się w wielkiej mierze Zachód, a przede wszystkim jego czołowa siła Stany Zjednoczone. Ale nie wolno też zapominać i pomniejszać historycznej roli pierestrojki, Gorbaczowa oraz tych nowych demokratycznych prądów, które torowały sobie drogę na wschodzie, a zwłaszcza w Polsce. Osobiście wspominam jako wielce pożyteczne, interesujące oraz inspirujące spotkania i rozmowy, jakie w latach 1987 i 1989 odbyłem z wiceprezydentem, a następnie już prezydentem George'em Bushem, a także z wieloma innymi amerykańskimi politykami, biznesmenami i dziennikarzami. Dzisiejsze spotkanie z Państwem jest więc cenne dla mnie również dlatego, iż stanowi kontynuację tego typu doświadczeń. Jeszcze raz za stworzenie mi tej możliwości dziękuję serdecznie.
Peter Schweitzer, the American journalist, had some interesting and very competent things to say on this matter in his recently published book Victory. The United States has pursued and continues to pursue a global policy, the major purpose of which was to put the former Soviet Union and the former Warsaw Pact on the defensive, to undermine and disintegrate it. The long-term goal are such transformations as would eliminate the bipolar structure of the world and disseminate the basic standards of democracy, the market economy, and human rights. It has to a large extent between the West, above all, its principal force, the United States, which has led to this coming about. But one should never forget the historical part played by Perestroika, Gorbachev, and those democratic currents which made their way to the East, above all, to Poland. I would like to say how positive, interesting, and inspiring were the meetings and talks I held with Vice President and then later President George Bush in 1987 and 1989, and also with many other American politicians, businessmen, and journalists. May I be allowed to say that today's meeting with you is thereby of great value to me as a continuation of that kind of experience. Once more, permit me to thank you most warmly for creating such a possibility.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was excellent. Nice job. Nice job. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've heard a very important address here this morning, a brilliant explanation of the President's role in the martial law of 1981 and of the events of 85, 86, 88, and 89. And you should know that this is the first time that the former President of Poland has ever had the occasion in this country to talk about those very important historical events of 1981. So I would like to bring the General back up here to answer a few of your questions. And if you do have questions, if you would move to the microphones on your left or right. So you could proceed right now to moving to your left or right if you have some questions of the General. Okay. General, would you come back up? And Mark, we have a couple of people who would like to ask questions. So would you just come right back up to the podium here? And why don't we start with this gentleman on the right here. Would you please go ahead and ask your question?
Good morning, General. The question I have is, to what extent did the Declaration of Martial Law give Poland a unique opportunity and sovereignty as opposed to the Warsaw Pact and the USSR?
Oczywiście, że polepszyło polską sytuację i
Yes, it improved the Polish situation in terms of protecting Polish borders.
myśmy wówczas rozpoczęli wprowadzanie pewnych reform, jakby to paradoksalnie nie brzmiało, właśnie w okresie stanu wojennego.
And it may be a paradox, but during martial law, we started introducing reforms in Poland.
Jak wiadomo, żadnych reform nie można przeprowadzić na lotnych piaskach.
And as you know, you cannot introduce reforms as you would build castles out of sand.
Stan wojenny był gorzką rzeczywistością, ale tę stabilizację zapewniał.
So martial law was a bitter reality, but it provided certain stability.
I tym samym zapewniał nam większe pole manewru, większą przestrzeń manewru w ramach bloku.
And by the same token, it gave us more room for maneuver within the Soviet bloc.
Ja dam parę przykładów.
Let me give you a few examples.
Wprowadziliśmy wówczas do konstytucji zapis o trwałości gospodarstw rolników indywidualnych, chłopów.
It was at that time that we amended our constitution to give constitutional right to the ownership of land for our farmers.
Przez całe dziesięciolecia Polska była krytykowana, że utrzymuje stan indywidualnej własności rolnej.
Because for decades we were criticized within the Soviet bloc that we had private agriculture.
Byliśmy jedynym krajem tego bloku, który właśnie taką strukturę w rolnictwie zachował.
Since we were the only country in the Soviet bloc that allowed for private ownership of land by farmers.
Ale dopiero w stanie wojennym stać nas było na to, ażeby wprowadzić do konstytucji jako zasadę trwałą i nienaruszalną pozostawanie tej indywidualnej własności.
But it was only during martial law, after the introduction of martial law, that we provided a constitutional right to the ownership of land.
Wprowadziliśmy instytucje nieznane wówczas bloku i raczej traktowane nieufnie.
So we have introduced an institution that was unknown in the Soviet bloc and was treated with great suspicion.
Jak Trybunał Konstytucyjny, Trybunał Stanu, Rzecznik Praw Obywatelskich.
We introduced Constitutional Court, court for, I'm not sure what would be the best translation here, but court dealing with political crimes,
Rzecznik Praw Obywatelskich.
And a spokesman for civil rights in Poland.
Wiele innych tego typu zmian, które były trudne do pomyślenia we wcześniejszym okresie.
And we introduced other reforms that were impossible. It was impossible to think about introducing them earlier in Poland.
Niestety istniejący wówczas konflikt i wewnątrz Polski i między Polską a krajami, które skierowały w stosunku do nas sankcje, ten konflikt utrudniał szybsze tempo przemian.
Unfortunately, it was not only the internal conflicts that we had in Poland, but also the international reaction to the introduction of martial law, which made it difficult to introduce those reforms.
Dopiero przyjście Gorbaczowa stworzyło nową jakościowo sytuację.
So it was only when Gorbachev came to power that a new situation developed.
To była dla nas wielka sprawa.
And that was very important for us in this context.
Thank you, General.
General Jaruzelski, what are your thoughts about the viability of a socialistic system? Do you think it's an outdated, idealistic philosophy, or do you think it has a prominent future?
W samej filozofii, w ideologii, która zrodziła się przecież w połowie XIX wieku,
As far as if we are talking about the socialist ideology, philosophy that was born in the mid-19th century,
było wiele elementów szlachetnych.
there were many noble ideas there.
Była to odpowiedź na bardzo trudny czas tych kapitalistycznych przemian, które powodowały kontrasty, które powodowały zubożenie wielu ludzi.
It was a response to the processes of early capitalism that led to impoverishment of many people.
I w tym sensie te idee były pewnym impulsem dla przemian, które się dokonywały w świecie.
So in this sense, you may say that this ideology was very important, stimulated a lot of events that occurred after that.
Przecież z ducha tych idei powstały nie tylko partie komunistyczne, ale i socjaldemokratyczne.
Because you have to realize that as a result of those ideas, not only the communist parties were created, but also social democratic parties.
Które po dzień dzisiejszy spełniają przecież ważną rolę.
That to this day are very important in politics.
Natomiast współcześnie ta ideologia okazała się w znacznej części utopijną.
However, to a large extent, this ideology in the present years turned out to be a utopia.
Jej fundamentów leżał pogląd, że człowiek może być właściwie idealny.
Because at the basis of this ideology was an assumption that we can have a perfect human being.
Że będzie się kierował względami altruistycznymi, pobudkami prospołecznymi.
Driven by altruistic motives, by serving the society.
To się okazało nierealne. Człowiek jest po prostu człowiekiem.
And it turned out to be unrealistic. human being is only a human being.
I zmierza do osiągnięcia swoich indywidualnych celów.
And the focus is on the achievement of individual goals.
Oczywiście one nie powinny być sprzeczne z interesami całego społeczeństwa,
Of course, they should not contradict the interests of the whole society.
ale one są podstawowym motorem działania i aktywności ludzkiej.
But they are the driving force of human activity.
Jednym słowem, to co było w tej idei pozostaje jako pewien długofalowy cel,
So you may say that what was at the basis of the socialist philosophy is still there, and it's the long-term goal.
który powoduje, że niezależnie od kraju, niezależnie od tego, kto nim rządzi,
So regardless of what country you are talking about, regardless of the political forces that are in power,
trzeba się liczyć z interesem społecznym.
you have to take public interest
Natomiast nie może to być powielenie tego, co robiliśmy w ramach realnego socjalizmu.
Definitely, you cannot do things as we have done in the system of so-called real socialism.
Który niezależnie od utopijności pewnych założeń popełnił wiele zasadniczych, bardzo głębokich błędów.
Which, regardless of the fact that many of those notions that we entertained were utopian, we have also made a lot of mistakes.
Oczywiście w okresie stalinowskim one nosiły charakter zbrodni.
Of course, during the Stalin period,
Później-
you could talk about crimes against humanity.
Później cechował je przede wszystkim niedostatek demokracji,
And then, of course, we didn't have democracy.
nieefektywna gospodarka
We had ineffective economy.
i dlatego te przemiany, które zaszły i zachodzą obecnie w Polsce, w innych krajach,
So the changes that occurred and
ówczesnego
are
bloku
occurring in Poland and in other countries of the former Soviet bloc
odpowiadają duchowi obecnego czasu,
are in the spirit of the current times.
a jednocześnie te doświadczenia, które mamy za sobą, pozwalają sądzić, że ich umiejętne wykorzystanie utrwali nas na tej właśnie drodze.
But the past experience, our experience is very important in terms of the lessons that we have learned that we can use in the future.
Good morning, General. First of all, I wanted to tell you that being Russian myself, I wanted to tell you that you have respect of many Russians for what you did back in 1981. And my question is, what do you think about Alexander Kwasniewski? And do you think it's possible for his government and Solidarnosc to work out some constructive relationship?
Спасибо вам за хорошее слово. Czy mogą dojść do porozumienia? Muszą dojść do porozumienia.
The question is not whether they can come to any agreement, but they have to come to an agreement.
To jest jednak jeden z podstawowych warunków, ażeby reformy w Polsce rozwijały się bezkolizyjnie.
This is one of the basic conditions for the reforms in Poland to continue.
Ale będzie to bardzo trudny proces.
But it will be a very difficult process.
No cóż, muszę tutaj powiedzieć, że duża część działaczy Solidarności, czy byłej Solidarności,
I have to say that many people in Solidarity, or rather former Solidarity,
traktuje zdobytą władzę jako swego rodzaju własność prywatną.
they treat the public offices that they have won as their personal property.
To znaczy, jeśli my rządzimy, to jest demokracja. Jeśli ktoś inny rządzi, to już demokracji nie ma.
They take a position that if they are in power, then we have democracy, but if someone else is in power, then it's undemocratic.
A ja uważam, że największym moralnym zwycięstwem Solidarności
But I think that the biggest moral victory of Solidarity
jest to, że została zrealizowana droga demokratyczna.
is that we have realized that we have entered the democratic path.
Że w majestacie demokratycznych procedur dokonują się zmiany rządów, zmiany prezydentów bez żadnych wstrząsów, które przecież są tak groźne dla kraju.
That using the democratic procedures that were laid down, we have orderly transition of power.
I ci działacze Solidarności, którzy zwalczają czy kwestionują wyniki demokratycznych wyborów,
So those people in Solidarity, the activists of Solidarity who question the results of elections,
faktycznie przekreślają to moralne zwycięstwo, do którego mają prawo, jako prekursorzy demokratycznych przemian.
they negate their moral victory, which they deserve to take credit for that.
Zatem Solidarność nie jest monolitem, to już nie jest ta Solidarność, która była kiedyś.
But the solidarity movement that we have now is not the solidarity movement that we had in the past.
Z jednej strony jest to związek zawodowy, nie największy zresztą,
On one hand, this is a labor union, not the largest one in Poland.
o bardzo populistycznym programie,
They have quite a populist agenda
jest dość istotnym odcieniem nacjonalizmu,
with some nationalistic notions.
a z drugiej strony jest to wiele ugrupowań politycznych, wiele partii politycznych,
On the other hand, they are in organization within which there are many political groups, many political parties.
niektóre są tak wielkie, że zmieściłyby się na jednej kanapie,
Some of those political parties could be seated on a single couch.
ale im są mniejsze, tym są bardziej głośne.
The smaller they are, the louder they are.
Tak. I to jest też jeden z tych problemów, który utrudnia to właściwe porozumienie.
And this is one of those problems that we have to accomplish a meaningful agreement.
Ale wszystko wynika stąd, że nasze doświadczenia demokratyczne są jeszcze dość nieduże, dość ubogie.
But the problem may be actually that our experience with democracy is relatively new,
Że kultury politycznej trzeba się uczyć.
that you have to learn political culture.
W Stanach Zjednoczonych demokracja trwa 200 lat
In this country, we have had democracy for over 200 years,
i też przechodziła przecież różne fazy.
and still we have to go through different stages.
Nasza jest bardzo, bardzo młoda.
And our democracy in Poland is very young.
I ja bym powiedział, że jak na młodość tej naszej polskiej demokracji, ona osiągnęła już bardzo wiele.
So if you keep in mind that we have a young democracy in Poland, we can say that we have accomplished quite a lot.
Że jednym słowem, na tym polu posuwamy się bardzo szybko.
So I think that we are moving at a quite rapid phase.
I dlatego ja wierzę, że jakaś formuła porozumienia wokół nadrzędnych spraw zostanie i będzie osiągnięta.
So I think that an agreement, especially with regard to some principal issues for Poland, will be reached.
Myśmy mieli okazję dzisiaj rozmawiać z panem profesorem, nazwisko proszę podać, panem Hestringiem, z redaktorem gazety, nazwę gazety.
I had a chance to talk today to Professor Hespring from the Department of Political Science at your university, and with the editor and the publisher of your local paper.
I właśnie pan profesor Helsing poruszył czy podjął, moim zdaniem, bardzo istotną kwestię.
And Professor Hersbrink brought to our attention a very important issue there.
Że w tamtym okresie myśmy dobrze nie rozumieli istoty polityki Stanów Zjednoczonych, a Stany Zjednoczone chyba nie do końca też rozumiały politykę ówczesnego rządu polskiego.
That at that period, the Polish government didn't understand the policy, American policy toward Poland, and vice versa.
Poza tym wiele reakcji cechowała emocjonalność, a emocje są, jak wiadomo, złym doradcą.
And also that many of those policies were taken because of emotions, were driven by emotions, and we know that those are not necessarily the best decisions.
Ja przyznaję się samokrytycznie do nadmiernej emocjonalności w reagowaniu.
I have to admit that I use too much emotions in the decision-making process.
Ale myślę, że ze strony amerykańskiej też można znaleźć tego typu przykłady.
But I think one could find examples of that also among the American politicians.
Ale najważniejsze jest wszystko to, co się dobrze kończy.
But what is important is if things end up well.
A to, że ja dzisiaj jestem wśród Państwa, świadczy o tym, że się dobrze kończy.
And one of the examples for the good end, the fortunate end, is that my presence here with you.
Że nawet bardzo trudna, ciężka i ciernista droga, jeśli prowadzi do właściwego finału, jak gdyby zamyka tę kartę różnych naszych grzechów i otwiera nową, z której powinniśmy jak najpełniej korzystać.
That even a difficult path, if it may lead to a new dimension in our relations, positive dimensions, may result in positive consequences.
Jeśli można mi tutaj dorzucić jedną taką już bardziej osobistą refleksję.
If I can also add one more, maybe more personal comment here.
A może nie tyle osobistą, co właśnie związaną z tym, że przebywam na terenie Stanów Zjednoczonych.
And maybe even not so much personal, but it has to do with the fact that I'm visiting now your country.
Upadek dwubiegunowego świata nakłada na Stany Zjednoczone znacznie większą niż kiedyś jeszcze odpowiedzialność. Upadek podzielonego na dwie części świata.
That I think that the fact that the bipolar world disintegrated puts even a heavier burden, stronger responsibility on the United States.
Zbigniew Brzeziński niedawno napisał ciekawą książkę, po polsku tytuł Bezład, po angielsku wiem, że jakoś inaczej.
Professor Zbigniew Brzeziński wrote recently an interesting book that General Jaruzelski doesn't know the English title, but in Polish literal translation would be Lawlessness, Disorder.
On podaje, że na przestrzeni historii występują państwa, które nazywa państwa katalizatory.
In this book, Brzeziński says that if we study human history, there are countries there that act as catalysts.
To znaczy państwa, które promieniują, które stanowią pewne wzorce dla innych.
The countries that set certain patterns, that set examples for others to follow.
Na przełomie XVIII i XIX wieku to była Francja.
On the turn of the 18th and 19th century, such a country was France,
Później Wielka Brytania.
then Great Britain.
No a po II wojnie światowej właściwie były te dwa ośrodki, które promieniowały. Jeden Stany Zjednoczone, a drugi w obszarze wschodniej Europy Związek Radziecki.
And after World War II, we had two centers that exerted their influence, the United States and in the Soviet bloc, the former Soviet Union.
Dzisiaj pozostają same Stany Zjednoczone.
And now we have the United States stand alone.
Jest to z jednej strony wielki motor przemian,
On one hand, this is a very powerful engine for change, for reforms,
oparcie dla przemian
and support for those
i
reforms.
jednocześnie pewien wzorzec.
And at the same time a certain example to follow.
I tu powiem może coś niepopularnego,
And allow me to say something that may be not very popular,
że nie każdy wzorzec daje się mechanicznie przenieść na grunt innego kraju.
Not every pattern can be followed, copied in a mechanical way.
Przy czym jest takie określenie, Państwo na pewno lepiej je znają niż ja jako ludzie nauki, syndrom późnego przybysza.
There is a certain syndrome, certain phenomenon that you may know as people of science that is maybe described as syndrome of a latecomer.
To znaczy, że kraje, które pozostają w tyle w sensie rozwoju różnych form życia społecznego i ekonomicznego, starają się w szybkim tempie naśladować te, które osiągnęły ten poziom wyższy.
That countries that are relatively undeveloped in political, economic, social terms, they try to develop in a very fast pace.
I usiłują osiągnąć to jednym skokiem,
So they attempt to do that overnight,
co jest po prostu niemożliwe,
which is impossible.
ale co wywołuje pewnego rodzaju rozczarowanie.
And then this is the source of disappointment.
Dlaczego my, zmieniając ustrój, nie żyjemy tak jak Amerykanie?
That why we have changed the system and we did not immediately achieve the, let's say, the standard of living of the United States.
I drugie, że nie zawsze przyjmuje się z tego wzorca wszystkie najlepsze elementy.
And at the same time, on the other hand, it also happens that when you copy a certain model, you also copy things that are not necessarily so positive.
Przecież i w tym wielkim, wspaniałym kraju, jakim są Stany Zjednoczone, też są różnego rodzaju trudne problemy, patologie.
Because even in this magnificent country, huge country, there are many issues that we could describe as pathologies.
I często one znajdują się jak gdyby na powierzchni.
And
One są najbardziej widoczne.
sometimes they are close to the surface. They are very visible.
Często widzimy to w telewizji, w filmie.
That you can see that on TV and in movies.
I one nie zawsze kształtują te najlepsze gusta.
And not necessarily then they shape the attitudes and tastes
Zwłaszcza powiadam, kiedy nie ma tej długiej tradycji demokratycznej.
that you would like to have, especially if you don't have a long democratic tradition in a country.
Także my chcemy korzystać z tych wielkich doświadczeń, które Stany Zjednoczone na drodze demokratycznej osiągnęły.
So we would like to use your tremendous experience that you have generated following the democratic path.
Chcemy się w pełni znaleźć w tym zachodnim świecie,
We want to be in the so-called Western world,
ale jednocześnie zachowując to, co jest właściwe dla naszej tradycji i naszej mentalności.
but we would like to keep also a number of things from our past and our tradition,
I zachowując dobre stosunki ze wszystkimi naszymi partnerami i sąsiadami.
and at the same time we want to maintain good relations with all of our partners and all of our neighbors.
Kiedyś prezydent Finlandii Urho Kekkonen powiedział:
Some time ago, President of Finland, Urho Kekkonen, said,
trzeba mieć przyjaciół blisko, a wrogów daleko.
you should have your friends close to you and enemies very far from you.
Ja chciałbym to nieco zmienić na taką formułę: trzeba mieć przyjaciół i blisko, i daleko.
Let me paraphrase that to say you should have friends close to you and far from you.
I naszym przyjacielem są Stany Zjednoczone i inne kraje Zachodu. Chcemy, żeby naszym przyjacielem była również Rosja i inne kraje, które z nami sąsiadują.
So the United States and other countries of the West are our friends now, but we also want Russia and all of our neighbors to be our friends.
General, excellent. Thank you very much. Just excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.